Cameras caught every twitch, every breath, every flicker of tension in the chamber that day. Bright lights bore down on the polished wood of the Senate hearing room, illuminating rows of tense-faced reporters with pens frozen above notepads, aides shifting uncomfortably, and viewers around the country glued to their screens. Ted Cruz leaned forward, voice cutting through the air like a blade, slicing across Jasmine Crockett's words for the 6th time. His interruption wasn't casual. It was sharp, deliberate, dripping with the condescension of someone convinced that louder meant stronger. That dominance was measured in decibels. The moment landed like a slap. The room stiffened. Crockett's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. The way a fighter studies an opponent, telegraphing the same tired punch. She had been patient, measured, calm, and generous with space that was never offered in return. But the 6th time was different. This wasn't just a senator cutting in. It was the embodiment of every time a powerful man thought he could bulldoze his way through truth by sheer force of interruption. Gasps rippled faintly through the chamber, picked up by the live microphones, carried instantly to millions of living rooms and smartphones. Did that just happen? People mouthed the words without sound, scrolling back the live stream, replaying the moment, shaking their heads at the arrogance. The hearing, meant to be a sober discussion of national importance, had turned into a theater of disrespect. Yet Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not snap back or stumble. Instead, she drew in a quiet breath, her expression unreadable, but her silence louder than Cruz's bark. That silence carried weight, a warning, a coiled spring waiting for the exact second to release. In that heartbeat of stillness, the balance shifted. The question hanging in the air was no longer whether she could withstand his arrogance. It was whether he could survive what was about to come. The chamber had witnessed countless clashes before, but none like this. Because while Cruz thought interruption was his weapon, he didn't realize he was sharpening hers. And as the camera zoomed closer, catching the steel in Crockett's eyes, one truth became unavoidable. The 7th interruption would not go the way he imagined. It would flip the entire room upside down. To understand why that 6th interruption carried so much weight, you have to step back and look at the battlefield it played out on. This wasn't just another Senate hearing. It was a national stage, the kind where words don't just echo within the marble walls, but ripple across the country, shaping headlines, fueling debates at kitchen tables, and etching themselves into the memory of a divided America. Every glare, every raised voice, every stolen second of airtime spoke to something far larger than two politicians locked in a verbal duel. On one side sat Ted Cruz, a man whose style has long been built on combativeness, turning hearings into spectacles, interruptions into weapons, and his voice into a blunt instrument meant to dominate rather than deliberate. For him, power is theater. An interruption is not just rudeness, but strategy. Drown out the opponent before their truth can pierce through. He didn't simply see himself as questioning a witness or colleague. He saw himself as an enforcer of hierarchy, a man who could keep others, especially women of color, in their place with the sheer force of his interruptions. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, representing something far greater than her own voice. She stood for every American who has been spoken over, dismissed, and belittled when their turn finally came to speak. Her composure was not just personal discipline, it was a signal of resistance. She carried into that chamber the weight of generations who were told to sit down, stay quiet, and wait for permission to be heard. And in that 6th interruption, the symbolism crystallized. This was no longer a skirmish between two lawmakers. It was a clash between entitlement and dignity, arrogance and truth. The old guard trying to cling to power and a new voice refusing to be silenced. The stakes were more than political theater. They were cultural, ideological, even moral. Because if Cruz's style of arrogance were to win, if interruption and condescension became the language that prevailed, it would send a chilling message that respect no longer mattered in our democracy. That silencing could masquerade as debate, and that truth could be buried beneath noise. It would mean that every person watching who had ever been cut off mid-sentence at work, dismissed in a classroom, or ignored in a conversation would once again see themselves mirrored in the victim. Not the victor, but if Crockett prevailed, if she turned his very weapon against him. Message would be just as powerful in the opposite direction. It would prove that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard, that calm composure can be more devastating than interruption, and that truth, when delivered with precision, can cut through the loudest noise. It would be a reminder to millions that interruption does not equal dominance and that arrogance is always one heartbeat away from collapse, and this is why. As the cameras zoomed tighter and the nation held its breath, the moment mattered far beyond Washington. Viewers weren't just wondering how Crockett would respond. They were asking themselves whether her response could shift the balance in every conversation where power tries to silence truth. They leaned closer to their screens, sensing that history wasn't about to be made with a gavel or a vote, but with a single, unflinching line. No one could have predicted what that line would be. But when it finally came, when the seventh interruption, it would not just shatter Cruz's composure, it would change the narrative forever. To grasp the magnitude of what unfolded, you have to understand the man at the center of it, Ted Cruz. For years, his reputation has preceded him grandstanding, combative, forever searching for a stage where his voice could thunder louder than reason. He has built a political career not on persuasion but on domination, not on dialogue but on interruption. To Cruz, the hearing room is less a forum for truth than a theater for spectacle. Where volume and swagger substitute for substance, Cruz has perfected this style over time. He relishes the moment when a witness falters under pressure, when colleagues shift in discomfort, when his booming interruptions seize control of the narrative. It is the tactic of a man who believes winning is not about light, but about heat overpower the room. And the facts won't matter. Over and over again, he has wielded this approach with little regard for how it corrodes the very ideals of deliberation and meant. Respect, Americans have seen it before. They saw it during the confirmation hearings of judges, when Cruz transformed questions into accusations, cutting off answers before they could land. They saw it when he mocked climate scientists on the Senate floor, preferring ridicule over reckoning with evidence. They saw it during the 2016 presidential primaries, where his debating style often devolved into sneers and interruptions, earning him as much contempt as applause. Even among his own party, Cruz has carried the reputation of arrogance, so much so that the late Senator John McCain once famously called him Wacko Bird, a moniker that, though delivered as an insult, Cruz wore as though it were a badge of honor. But arrogance is only half the story. The other half is hypocrisy. Time and again, Cruz has championed the language of respect and civility when it served him, only to discard it the moment it became inconvenient. He rails against cancel culture while silencing others with interruptions. He lectures about tradition and decorum while sneering across the Senate floor. He warns of radical elites while indulging in the very grandstanding that alienates colleagues and constituents alike. This dissonance has fueled frustration across the political spectrum, leaving many Americans with the impression that Cruz is less a leader than a provocateur, less a statesman than a performer auditioning for an audience of one. Himself, it is this pattern arrogance laced with hypocrisy that made the sixth interruption feel so loaded. Viewers had seen this play before. They knew the script. Cruz interrupts, the other person struggles to be heard, the exchange spirals into a display of dominance. For some, it was maddening. For others, it was predictable. And yet, for millions watching that day, there was a quiet hope. Maybe this time, the script would flip. The frustration had been building long before this clash with Jasmine Crockett. Viral clips of Cruz berating witnesses, mocking colleagues, or cutting off women mid-sentence had already sparked backlash online. Hashtags mocking his interruptions had trended before. Memes of his smirks had circulated widely. His trips to cable news, designed to amplify his brand, often left a bitter aftertaste. His base might have cheered, but the broader public grew increasingly weary. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was exhaustion. People were tired of the noise, tired of the sneers, tired of the interruptions, and yet Cruz pressed on, convinced that what had worked before would work again. The sixth interruption wasn't a slip of temper. It was strategy. In his mind, he was doing what he always did, commanding the floor, asserting dominance, drowning out an opponent before her words could pierce the veil. But arrogance blinds as much as it emboldens. What Cruz failed to see in that moment was that Crockett wasn't just another opponent to bulldoze. She was the wrong person at the wrong time for his favorite tactic. Because Crockett didn't just represent herself. She represented every American tired of being interrupted, dismissed, and spoken over. She carried the strength of a story rooted in resilience, not entitlement. And when she met interruption with composure, when she let silence hang heavier than his words, she was doing something Cruz had never accounted for. She was turning his weapon into a weakness. For once, the interruption would not silence the truth. For once, the sneer would not win the day. And for once, the arrogance would not stand unchallenged. But what Cruz didn't see coming this time, his favorite tactic would backfire. To understand why this confrontation became more than just a political spat, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is, not just the congresswoman on camera that day, but the fighter who walked a long road to reach that chair across from Ted Cruz. Jasmine Crockett is not a product of entitlement or a legacy name handed down through dynasties. She is a product of grit, of work, of a refusal to let anyone silence her voice. Long before she set foot in the halls of Congress, she was a lawyer in courtrooms where the stakes were not political points but people's lives. She represented the unheard, the overlooked, the ones whose cases never made headlines, but whose dignity mattered all the same. In those courtrooms, she learned what it meant to face off against arrogance, not as a performance, but as a matter of survival for her clients. It wasn't the easy path. She faced doubt, skepticism, even mockery. There were those who looked at her and underestimated her simply because she was a black woman in spaces long dominated by white men. But where others might have bent under the weight of that condescension, Crockett sharpened herself against it. Every dismissal became fuel. Every interruption became training. Every sneer became a reminder. If she didn't fight for fairness, who would? That fighting spirit soon spilled beyond the courtroom. Crockett wasn't content with justice case by case. She wanted systemic change. She stepped into activism, standing shoulder to shoulder with communities that had been ignored and voiceless for too long. Whether it was housing rights, racial justice, or fair representation, she became a relentless advocate for those pushed to the margins. And in every rally, every press conference, every late-night strategy session, the pattern repeated. Arrogance tried to shout her down, and she refused to move. By the time she entered politics, Crockett had already built a reputation as a fighter who didn't just speak, but spoke with precision. She cut through the noise the way a scalpel cuts through skin, sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. That precision wasn't theatrical. It was born of experience. It came from the years of being underestimated, having to make every word count in spaces where opponents waited for her to falter. Her rise to Congress wasn't a gift. It was earned step by step. And when she arrived, she brought with her the weight of all the people she had carried along the way, the clients she had defended, the neighborhoods she had walked, the activists who had linked arms beside her. To her constituents, she wasn't just a politician. She was a mirror of their own resilience. To the broader public, she became a symbol of a new generation unwilling to play by the rules of arrogance. That symbolism mattered deeply in the confrontation with Cruz, because in many ways, Crockett was the embodiment of the very values Cruz routinely dismissed: fairness, respect, patience, and precision. Where Cruz thrived on noise, Crockett thrived on clarity. Where Cruz relied on performance, Crockett relied on preparation. Where Cruz wielded arrogance as a weapon, Crockett wielded resilience as armor. The emotional connection she built with audiences, over time, made her more than just another face on a committee. People who had been interrupted in their own workplaces saw themselves in her. Women who had been dismissed mid-sentence by arrogant men felt their own frustrations echoed in her pauses. Young people who believed politics was nothing more than theater found in her a glimpse of something different: its authenticity. This is why her patience that day mattered. Every time Cruz interrupted, she didn't snap. She didn't fall into the trap of shouting back. She held herself steady, knowing millions were watching not just for words, but for dignity. And in that steadiness, she represented something bigger than herself. Yet patience has limits. 6 times, he cut her off. 6 times he tried to bulldoze his way through her point. 6 times he repeated the tactic that had carried him through so many hearings before. Each interruption was a spark against dry tinder, not just in the room, but across the nation watching online. You could almost feel the collective inhale of audiences thinking, how much more will she take? For Crockett, those interruptions weren't simply rudeness. They were echoes of a lifetime of being underestimated. They carried with them the weight of every courtroom sneer, every political dismissal, every cultural whisper that said, sit down, be quiet, know your place. But Crockett had never accepted those terms. She had built her entire career on rejecting them. And so, by the time the 6th interruption came, the patience that had carried her through years of condescension was stretched thin. This was no longer just about one exchange in one hearing room. This was about a lifetime of battles against arrogance. This was about showing once and for all that silence was not submission in, that dignity could outlast even the loudest voice. What? Cruz saw as a routine interruption. Crockett felt as a line in the sand. And when that 6th interruption hit, her resolve hardened. She was not just a congresswoman at that moment. She was the lawyer who had defended the powerless, the activist who had marched for justice, the woman who had weathered every attempt to speak over her. The stage was set. The nation was watching, and the audience, already weary of arrogance, leaned forward, because they sensed what Cruz could not, this time. The silence before her words was more powerful than his noise, and when the 6th interruption came, her patience was stretched to the limit. The chamber had the hum of restrained chaos, the kind that builds when 2 forces meet, and neither is willing to step aside. On one side sat Ted Cruz, shoulders leaning forward, lips curled into that practiced smirk he had perfected across years of televised hearings. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, posture steady, gaze fixed. Her patience a taut line stretched across the weight of the moment. It started small. The 4th interruption. Cruz's voice cut through hers like static breaking into a song, jarring and deliberate. His words weren't even sharp arguments. They were tactics, wedges meant to derail her rhythm and reassert dominance. Crockett paused, letting the silence sit heavy in the room, her eyes briefly flicking toward him, then back to her point. She recalibrated without raising her tone, resuming with clarity. He smirked again, as if to say, I can keep doing this all day. The 5th interruption came faster. He leaned in this time, waving his hand slightly, dismissing her argument before it even finished forming. Reporters in the room shifted, pens hovering, noting the repetition of the maneuver. Crockett did not flinch. She adjusted once more, her composure intact, her words sharpened by the forced pause. That restraint was no accident, it was strategy. For every interruption, she made her return more precise, her points landing with the weight of a hammer quietly striking nails into a coffin. By now, the audience watching live could feel it. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a countdown. Each break in her rhythm wasn't a victory for Cruz, but another number ticked off toward something bigger. 4th, 5th, 6th. The air thickened with anticipation. Cruz, emboldened by his own noise, mistook her composure for weakness. He leaned back after the 5th, a satisfied gleam in his eye, as if the battle was already won. He believed that by cutting her off, he could drain her presence, force her into exasperation, prove himself the louder, stronger voice. But arrogance blinds. He didn't see how the tide was shifting, how each interruption was no longer landing as dominance, but as pettiness. Then came the 6th. Cruz's voice pierced again, louder now, impatient, almost desperate. Crockett's hands rested calmly on the desk, her expression unchanged, though her silence spoke volumes. Viewers leaned forward, sensing the shift. This time, she didn't rush to re-enter the conversation. She let the weight of the disrespect linger in the air. In that silence, something changed. Not in her, but in him. The cameras caught it. A flicker in Cruz's eyes, a faint tightening of his jaw, as though some part of him recognized he was losing control of the narrative by now. The chamber wasn't just watching a senator and a congresswoman spar. They were witnessing a test of dignity against arrogance, patience against noise. Each interruption had revealed more than Cruz intended. Instead of silencing her, he had exposed his own insecurity. Instead of shaking her, he had underscored her steadiness. What he thought was dominance was unraveling into self-sabotage. Crockett, still composed, still measured, waited. Her silence was no longer defensive. It was a weapon. She allowed the sixth interruption to hang in the room like a challenge unanswered, her very calmness daring him to make the next move. And Cruz, blinded by his own ego, took the bait. He prepared to cut her off once more, convinced that repetition alone would break her stride. But what he didn't realize was that the chamber, the cameras, the millions watching online, were no longer asking, will Crockett lose her composure? They were asking how long until Cruz collapses under the weight of his own arrogance. The tension built like a drumbeat. Fourth, fifth, sixth, each one a step closer to the inevitable. The audience felt it in their chests. The breaking point was near, but the seventh was the breaking point not for her, but for him. For a fleeting moment after the sixth interruption, the chamber seemed frozen. Cameras caught Crockett's stillness, hands folded, gaze unbroken, her silence radiating composure in the face of noise. Many watching thought she might simply let it pass, swallow the disrespect as so many before her had been forced to do. That's what Cruz counted on. That was the rhythm of his dominance. Interruption, smirk, dismissal, repeat, but silence, when wielded by the right person, is not surrender. It is the coiling of a spring, the quiet before an inevitable release. Crockett was not retreating. She was waiting for the moment when his arrogance finally peaked, when his interruptions had piled so high they collapsed under their own weight. And then, with the seventh, the break came. Cruz leaned forward again, voice sharpened with impatience, cutting across her words mid-sentence, as though his entitlement were law. His tone dripped with condescension, the same practiced sneer he had used countless times before. But this time, as his interruption sliced through, Crockett didn't pause to recalibrate. She didn't defer, didn't retreat into composure. She let him finish his sneer, then leaned ever so slightly toward the microphone. Her voice was calm, not raised, not frantic measured, deliberate. She spoke with the precision of someone who had weighed her words long before uttering them. And then, in a line that would ricochet across the country, she delivered her counterstrike. Senator, if interruption were evidence, you'd have won this case hours ago. But it's not. And the louder you get, the clearer it becomes. You're not here to seek truth. You're here because you're afraid of it. The chamber stilled. Cruz blinked, the smirk faltering for the first time. He had expected pushback, maybe even a raised voice, something he could swat away with more noise. But Crockett had chosen a different weapon. Truth delivered with surgical calm. The power wasn't in the volume. It was in the precision, in the mirror she held up to his tactics. Gasps rippled through the room. A few aides stifled laughter, their eyes darting as though unsure whether to hide their amusement or let it spill. Reporters froze mid-note, pens suspended above pads as the weight of the line sank in. Even the camera seemed to lean closer, the lens zooming tighter on Cruz's expression as he struggled to process what had just unfolded. A man so accustomed to dominance by interruption. The silence that followed was suffocating. He opened his mouth as if to fire back, but the words stuck. For once, his rhythm had been broken not by a louder voice, but by one that cut deeper. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his papers, fumbling for composure. The more he tried to reclaim it, the clearer it became. Crockett had landed the blow he never saw coming. It wasn't just the content of her words, it was the delivery. She hadn't shouted, hadn't bristled. She had spoken as though the truth were self-evident, as though it needed no defense. And in doing so, she made Cruz look not like a fierce debater, but like a man exposed, caught in the act of mistaking volume for victory. The murmurs grew louder. A senator seated nearby glanced down to hide a smile. One aide bit his lip to keep from laughing outright. The chamber had seen countless sparring matches, but rarely did arrogance collapse so suddenly, so visibly. Cruz tried to reassert himself, fumbling with his notes, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. His smirk reappeared, but thinner now, brittle, more mask than confidence. He shifted in his seat again, eyes darting toward the cameras as though searching for a lifeline. But the cameras weren't his allies this time. They were magnifiers. Capturing every flicker of discomfort, every crack in the facade. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or lean back triumphantly. She simply returned to her point, steady as ever, as though the exchange hadn't rattled her in the slightest. That restraint was the final twist of the knife. She didn't need to perform victory, it was already hers. The room, once thick with Cruz's interruptions, now belonged to her. Each word she spoke afterward carried the authority of someone who had weathered the storm and turned it into silence. The more she continued with calm precision, the more Cruz shrank into the background, his earlier bluster dissolving in the weight of what had just unfolded, and the audience, watching both in the chamber and across the nation, felt it. On social media, the moment was already being clipped, shared, dissected. Tweets with captions like "She ended him," and "That's how you handle arrogance," spread like wildfire. Commentators whispered about how rare it was to see Cruz so visibly shaken. His favorite tactic flipped on its head, because in politics, moments matter. And this was not just another exchange lost in the noise of Washington. This was a crystallizing moment, a reminder that arrogance is not invincible, that composure can break louder weapons, and that dignity, when wielded with precision, doesn't just resist disrespect. It dismantles it. Cruz's fumbling attempts to regain the floor only deepened the contrast. His once commanding voice now sounded defensive, forced. Each word he managed to squeeze in after that line was met with less attention, less gravity. Crockett had stolen the spotlight, not with spectacle, but with restraint. And in that, she proved a truth larger than the hearing itself. Power built on arrogance is fragile. The chamber seemed to know it too. Even as the proceedings resumed, the energy had shifted irreversibly. The interruption strategy that Cruz had wielded for years had finally turned against him. And though he sat there, still speaking, still trying to reassert his dominance, the story was no longer his to tell. It belonged to Crockett. To the woman who, with one line, had transformed an interruption into indictment, arrogance into exposure, noise into silence. And yet, what made this moment even more explosive was what happened after the hearing. Because while the chamber sat in stunned silence, outside those walls a firestorm was already beginning. Clips were spreading, hashtags were forming, and millions who had never watched a Senate hearing in their lives were about to see Ted Cruz's smirk falter. Frame by frame, what happened outside that room made the moment explode worldwide. It didn't take long. Before Cruz had even left the chamber, the seventh line was already making its rounds online. A single clip, just 20 seconds long, was clipped from the hearing feed, posted to Twitter with the caption, "Crockett just ended Cruz in one line." Within minutes, it spread like wildfire. Hashtags formed almost instantly. Hashtag Crockett v. Cruz surged to the top of trending lists, followed closely by hashtag seventh line. People who had never paid attention to Senate hearings were suddenly glued to their screens, replaying the moment again and again. The silence after her words, Cruz's faltering smirk, the ripple of muffled laughter in the room, it all became digital theater, replayed millions of times in just a few hours. On TikTok, users remixed the clip with dramatic music, zooming in on Cruz's stunned expression as text overlays read, "When arrogance finally meets its match." Others slowed the footage down, highlighting the exact second his eyes flickered and his composure cracked. Instagram flooded with reels comparing the moment to iconic political takedowns of the past. While on YouTube, reaction channels broke down the exchange frame by frame, praising Crockett's delivery as a masterclass in calm precision. Then came the memes. Cruz's bewildered face became a template overnight. One viral post showed him holding a shattered microphone with the caption, "When the interruption gets interrupted." another. Ack! Featured Crockett's calm expression superimposed onto scenes from boxing films. Framed as the underdog who lands the knockout punch. Twitter threads compiled his history of interruptions alongside Crockett's line, painting it as the perfect karmic reversal. Commentators weighed in. Some called it the moment arrogance collapsed under its own weight. Others described it as the purest distillation of dignity, defeating noise. Activists praised Crockett not just for defending herself, but for embodying the frustrations of millions who had been talked over in workplaces, classrooms, and everyday conversations. Celebrities joined in, amplifying the moment beyond politics. A-list actors tweeted quotes from the line with fire emojis. Musicians clipped it into their Instagram stories, calling it bars and comparing it to a flawless diss track. Even athletes weighed in, posting it alongside captions like, "This is what composure under pressure looks like." The cultural crossover was immediate and unstoppable. Meanwhile, Cruz found himself on the receiving end of mockery that no press team could contain. His attempt to reframe the moment in interviews only fueled the fire. Every time he insisted he wasn't rattled, the viral footage of his fumbling expression played beside it, undermining his words. For once, the man who thrived on soundbites had become the soundbite, only not the kind he wanted. Crockett, by contrast, was elevated to a new level of recognition. Headlines called her fearless, the truth-teller Washington needs, and the woman who broke the interruption game. Her calm delivery was dissected in think pieces, praised as both strategic brilliance and emotional resilience. For many, she became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol of resistance against arrogance and dismissal. The ripple effect stretched further than Washington punditry. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of poise under pressure. Office workers shared it in Slack channels with captions like, "This is how I want to respond in the next meeting." Parents even showed it to their kids. Framing it as a lesson in standing your ground without losing your calm, it wasn't just political, it was personal. Crockett's seventh line resonated because it felt universal. Who hadn't been interrupted? Who hadn't faced someone louder, more arrogant, trying to drown them out? In her calm counterattack, millions saw themselves. Her victory wasn't only hers, it was collective. By nightfall, the clip had been viewed tens of millions of times across platforms. Commentators compared it to legendary debate moments, saying it would be studied for years. But even as the jokes and memes dominated feeds, a deeper undercurrent began to emerge. Because behind the laughter, people recognized something more profound, that her line wasn't just about Cruz, or even about politics. It was about power, dignity, and the refusal to be silenced. And that realization was only beginning to take root. Because beyond the memes, the deeper meaning of that seventh line was just beginning to sink in. In the days that followed, as the dust of memes and headlines settled, the essence of what Jasmine Crockett had done became clearer. That seventh line was never just a clever retort. Never just a viral clapback designed to embarrass Ted Cruz. It was a reframing of power itself. A reminder that dignity cannot be silenced, and that truth cannot be drowned out by arrogance. No matter how loud it grows, Crockett understood something fundamental. Interruption is not strength, is fear masquerading as dominance. Each time Cruz cut across her words, he revealed not mastery of debate, but desperation to contain what she represented. And when she finally broke through, calm and precise, she turned his tactic on its head. In her restraint, she proved that silence has a power arrogance can never command. Her words carried the weight of symbolism far beyond the chamber. For women of color across the country, it was not just Crockett speaking, it was generations standing tall against the institutional arrogance that had tried to quiet them. For immigrants and their children, it was proof that voices once dismissed as outsider could now command national attention, not by shouting, but by refusing to be silenced. And for anyone who had ever been interrupted, overlooked, or dismissed, it was validation that dignity, when held firmly, always outlasts noise. You can't silence dignity. You can't shout over truth. That was the universal truth her moment crystallized. In a world overflowing with noise, where arrogance too often disguises itself as authority, Crockett's calm precision cut through like a bell. It reminded people that integrity doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard, and that justice doesn't tremble before interruption. The inspirational crescendo of this story is not just that Ted Cruz lost composure. It's that Jasmine Crockett showed a new way forward, a model of resistance rooted not in matching arrogance blow for blow, but in exposing its weakness by standing unshaken. She didn't just defeat Cruz in a single moment, she dismantled the very foundation of his tactic, showing that interruption cannot withstand truth, and that is why her seventh line was more than a mic drop. It was a mirror held up to a culture of dismissal, a declaration that dignity belongs to everyone who refuses to be erased. The chamber may have heard only one woman's voice, but the nation heard an anthem. Truth breaks arrogance, every single time. And that's why this one moment will echo long beyond that chamber. And so we return to where it all began, the moment that lit up the nation. Jasmine Crockett destroys Ted Cruz after his sixth interruption. The seventh line breaks him. It wasn't just a headline. It was the truth of what millions witnessed arrogance unraveling before dignity, its noise collapsing under the weight of calm precision. Crockett's seventh line didn't just silence Cruz in that chamber. It silenced the idea that interruption equals strength. It shattered the illusion that arrogance can talk over justice forever. In its place, it offered something far more powerful, the reminder that truth, spoken with clarity, will always carry farther than bluster. This was never just about two people in a hearing. It was about the values we choose to honor as a nation. Do we reward arrogance, or do we amplify dignity? Do we let lies and interruptions dominate the stage, or do we lean into the courage of those who refuse to be silenced? That's why this moment matters, because it wasn't only Cruz who was broken. It was the tactic itself, the old game of talking over truth until it disappears. Crockett showed us that when dignity stands its ground, arrogance has nowhere left to go. And now, the choice is ours. If you believe interruptions can't stop the truth, share this moment. Let others see that composure beats arrogance, that dignity silences noise. And if you want to be part of a movement that amplifies voices of justice, resilience, and truths, subscribe. Join us. Because every time dignity rises, every time truth breaks through, we grow stronger together. The seventh line was just the beginning. The echo belongs to all of us.